The rule on a battlefield is simple. If an MG-42 sees you, you disappear. But on February 1st, 1944, a 20-year-old American kid did the unthinkable. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He climbed to the highest, most exposed point in the entire field and dared 3 German machine gun teams to kill him. For the next 2 hours, every bullet in a 300-yard radius was aimed at one man, and somehow he turned himself into human bait that shattered a German assault and saved 30 Americans who couldn't move. The battlefield at Anzio didn't look like a place where legends were made. It was flat, cold, colorless, just miles of plowed farmland, winter stubble, and earth so hard you could strike sparks off it with a shovel. Nothing about it suggested heroism. Nothing suggested survival. But on the morning of February 1st, 1944, something impossible was about to unfold on that empty field. Something no tactics, manual, no military school, and no sane officer could ever have predicted. The man at the center of it wasn't a hardened ranger, a decorated sergeant, or a veteran with years of combat behind him. He was Private First Class Alton Warren Knappenberger, age 20. A quiet kid from Springmount, Pennsylvania, built not by doctrine, not by elite training, but by the woods. Before the war, Springmount was the kind of place where boys grew up, learning the rhythm of the forest the way city kids learned traffic lights. Alton spent every fall in the tree stands with his father, tracking white-tailed deer along narrow trails cut through oak, birch, and pine. It wasn't sport for him, it was discipline. You climbed above the ground because deer rarely looked up. You waited because impatience meant empty-handed mornings. You fired only when you were sure, because ammunition cost money, and waste was a sin. From the age of 12, Alton learned a simple hunter's creed. Height is vision. Vision is control. Control decides life and death. He didn't know it then, but those 3 truths would follow him across the Atlantic to a battlefield where hesitation killed, where miscalculations were paid for in human lives, and where his instincts, not his training, would decide the fate of his platoon. When the draft pulled him in during 1943, there was nothing unusual about him. He wasn't the strongest recruit, nor the fastest. His marksmanship scores were good, but not remarkable. Where he stood out quietly, almost invisibly, was endurance. 10-hour days, hauling bricks at the local factory, had carved muscle into him without fanfare. He could work until others quit. He could wait until others broke. Fort Meade taught him the basics. Rifle drills, squad movement, how to fire and reload the M1 Garand. But the moment they handed him the BAR, the Browning automatic rifle, everything changed. The bar wasn't elegant, it wasn't comfortable, and it certainly wasn't forgiving. Loaded, it weighed more than 11 kilograms. 20 rounds to a magazine, a shoulder-bruising recoil that punished the unprepared. 2 fire modes, slow for control, fast for aggression. It wasn't meant to be carried by a hunter. It was meant to be carried by the backbone of an American infantry squad, the one man responsible for putting down enough firepower to keep everyone else alive. Most men dreaded it. Alton accepted it. Not because he wanted glory, he didn't. Not because he wanted responsibility, he didn't. But because the BAR felt familiar in a strange, instinctive way. Heavy, deliberate, unforgiving. It behaved like the forest itself. It rewarded patience. It punished waste. It demanded calculation over panic. When his unit, the 30th Infantry Regiment of the legendary 3rd Division, sailed to Italy, the war swallowed him whole. Salerno, the Volturno River, the shadow of Monte Cassino, mud, exhaustion, and the steady thinning of the platoon roster. He learned to survive by listening to mortar fall patterns, to the crack of the Car 98K, to the tearing snarl of the MG-42 when it opened up. He learned what men looked like before they broke and what they looked like after. Still, he was unremarkable. A dependable rifleman, a quiet presence in a loud, violent world. Nothing, absolutely nothing, suggested he would soon become the centerpiece of a 2-hour gunfight that would enter military legend, but the stage for that story was being built long before he stepped onto it. Operation Shingle, the landing at Anzio, was supposed to be a stroke of genius, an outflanking maneuver to crack the Gustav line and open the road to Rome. Instead, hesitation turned it into a trap. By the end of January 1944, elite German reinforcements, Panzer Grenadiers, Fallschirmjäger veterans, and units hardened in North Africa had encircled the beachhead. The Allies weren't advancing anymore. They were holding on. Company C, Alten's company, received orders on January 31st to push forward near the small town of Cisterna. It was a simple reconnaissance patrol, 300 meters forward, identify enemy positions, return home. The kind of mission that looked straightforward on paper and turned nightmarish the moment boots touched the frozen soil. The terrain was the problem. It was too flat, too quiet, too open. No trees, no ditches, no walls, no cover but the shallow depressions carved by years of plowing. To a hunter's eye, it was worse than danger. It was design a place where someone wanted you exposed. At 11:45 a.m., the trap snapped shut. An MG-42 tore the silence apart from 85 yards ahead. A second opened up from the left, a third from the right. The Germans had arranged their machine guns not randomly, but mathematically, each covering the blind spots of the others, creating a lethal crossfire web that turned Company C into silhouettes waiting to be erased. Men dove for the ground. Some didn't make it. Bullets chewed the earth into dust. Anyone who moved was cut down. Anyone who raised a helmet exposed it to a 1,200 round per minute saw blade of steel. For 15 minutes, the platoon was paralyzed, pinned, bleeding, unable to crawl forward, unable to retreat, unable to even lift their heads to understand what was killing them. Most soldiers think in two directions during an ambush: down for cover or back for safety. But Alten's mind, shaped by years in tree stands, didn't work that way. Flat ground was death. Height was life. Height meant seeing what others could not. And 60 yards ahead, unbelievably, impossibly, was a small rise in the earth, a lump, a bump, barely 3 meters higher than the field around it. To anyone else, it was worthless. To a hunter, it was everything. That was the moment, the exact second, when the battlefield split into two timelines. The one every soldier lived in, where you keep your head down and pray, and the one Alten stepped into, where you climb toward the danger because it's the only place you can finally see the truth. He whispered to the man beside him, "I'm going to that knoll." "You'll be dead in 10 seconds, the soldier hissed back. "Maybe," Alten said, "but they can't kill all of us if they're shooting at me." And with that, without permission, without orders, without even a backward glance, he dragged 11 kilograms of steel into the open and began the crawl that would decide whether 30 Americans lived or died that day. The moment Alten left the shallow depression, he stopped being a rifleman in a patrol. He became bait moving, bait crossing a field where every inch of earth was already owned by German machine guns. His elbows dug into the frozen soil as he crawled, dragging the BAR behind him like a wounded animal. The ground cut into his palms. Frost stung his fingers. Dirt filled the cracks in his knuckles. He kept his body completely flat, chest scraping, boots sliding, breath held so long it felt like drowning. 10 yards, then 15. Ahead of him, the knoll sat silent, indifferent, nothing more than a hump of hardened earth left behind by some forgotten plow. It wasn't designed for cover. It wasn't meant to save lives. It was just higher than everything else, and right now, height was the only currency that mattered. Behind him, the platoon remained pinned, rifles useless, helmets pressed into the soil, waiting for the next burst to end them. Alten kept moving. At 20 yards, a burst from the left MG-42 ripped across the field. The sound was unmistakable, metal tearing fabric, a buzzsaw spinning through air. Bullets tore a line in the dirt 2 meters to his left. The impact showered him with cold dust. He didn't freeze. Hunters never froze. Freezing got you spotted. He waited 10 seconds, a full, eternal 10, until the MG-42 paused to change belts. Then he crawled again. At 30 yards, he passed the body of an American soldier, lying face down, blood dried into black cracks along his back. Alton didn't look twice. Grief and fear were luxuries he could afford later, if he lived. Now, only distance mattered. Only angles mattered. Only survival mattered. 40 yards. 50. The knoll grew larger, only in the way death grows larger as it approaches. Every second was a calculation. When will they see me? When will they adjust fire? He imagined 3 machine gun crews scanning the field, waiting for the smallest twitch of movement so they could erase it. But they didn't see him. Not yet. They were still focused on the platoon, on the bigger shapes, the louder cries, the helmets that occasionally lifted a fraction too high. Alton pushed the last few yards, crawling up the incline. If the Germans looked now, if one man among them simply had better instincts than the others, it would all be over. But no one looked. No one expected a lone American to crawl toward them. No one expected a man to willingly move into the mouth of 3 MG-42s. He reached the crest, and the battlefield transformed. From the platoon's perspective, the world was a wall of noise and dust. From the knoll, the world was geometry. The entire field unfolded like a map. MG Nest. 1, at 85 yards, 3-man crew, tripod mount, sandbags packed high. MG Nest #2, at 100 yards left, 2 men visible, belt feeder kneeling behind the gunner. MG Nest #3, at 120 yards right, almost invisible, only a barrel jutting from the earth, expertly camouflaged. And behind him, spread across 150 meters of frozen soil, 30 Americans who could not move. Alton exhaled once, slow, steady. Then he switched the bar to slow fire, the hunter's setting. Less waste, more control. He lined up his sights on the closest nest. At 85 yards, the German gunner was a silhouette behind sandbags, head bobbing with each burst. Alton steadied his breathing, pressing his cheek against the wood stock, the smell of oil and sweat comforting in a strange, familiar way. He squeezed the trigger. 4 shots, 4 measured pulses. Not the frantic scream of a man fighting for his life, but the deliberate rhythm of a hunter taking a clean shot. The German gunner fell backward. The feeder turned, confusion flashing across his face. Alton fired again, 3 rounds. Second man down. The third German, some combination of courage and instinct, tried to run. A final 2-round burst cut him down. MG-42, Nest #1 went silent. For a fraction of a second, the battlefield froze. Then, chaos exploded. The field erupted. MG-42 fire shredded the air around Alton. Bullets snapped past him with sharp, angry cracks. One round buried itself 6 inches from his skull, exploding dirt into his eyes. Another tore into the sleeve of his uniform, spinning fibers into the wind. A third slammed into the BAR stock, carving a deep groove into the wood millimeters from ending everything. He rolled 2 meters to the right. Not far, not panicked, just enough. Hunters knew. Predators shot at where you were, not where you move. The Germans kept firing, plowing the crest of the knoll with relentless bursts, trying to erase the lone silhouette that had suddenly turned the tide. But Alton wasn't a silhouette. He was motion. He was instinct. He was a man who had spent his childhood learning how not to be seen, even when fully exposed. 2 German grenadiers broke from the left, Panzer grenadiers, elite infantry moving low and fast in bounding leaps. Their helmets bobbed as they sprinted, their bodies weaving in and out of folds of terrain, closing the distance to the knoll. 50 yards, 40, 30. Alton held his fire. Patience. Wait for the clean shot. 20 yards. He fired 6 rounds in a single, tight burst. The first grenadier dropped instantly. The second raised a stick grenade, arm cocked to throw. Alton fired again. 4 rounds. The grenade left the man's hand as he fell, detonating harmlessly 15 meters away. Silence returned briefly, deceptively. Nest #2 resumed firing, but the gunner was unstable, spooked, unsure where the shots had come from. Alton switched the BAR to fast fire, unleashing a 10-round burst across the nest. Tracer rounds cut bright lines through the winter air. The gunner ducked. The feeder's silhouette twisted, then disappeared. Another burst. Another body slumped. 2 nests down. 1 to go. But the third was well positioned, invisible behind earthworks and camo netting, firing with mechanical precision. Alton couldn't kill what he couldn't see, not yet. He checked his magazine. 3 rounds left. 2 magazines remaining on his belt. 43 rounds total. Too little. Far too little. But he didn't have time to worry about that because a new threat was forming. Alton saw movement beyond Nest #320 to 30 German infantry in staggered formation, advancing in bounds, textbook assault tactics. Their objective was obvious: overrun the knoll, kill the American, reopen the killing field. They started at 150 yards, moving with dangerous discipline. Alton made a brutal, necessary decision. Ignore Nest #3. Focus everything on the infantry. At 100 yards, he opened fire. Short bursts. Precise corrections. The BAR bucked against his shoulder as he fired round after round, each one chosen, each one placed, each one buying seconds for the pinned Americans behind him. Men fell, chests torn open, legs collapsing, bodies spinning into the dirt. 5 down, then 7, then 10. The German officer shouted for a retreat. The survivors crawled back into the folds of terrain, leaving their comrades behind. Alton exhaled. Only then did he hear it, the hollow, empty click of the BAR's bolt locking back on an empty magazine. He reached for his belt. 1 magazine left, 20 rounds. But Nest #3 was still firing. The German infantry was regrouping, and Alton knew the truth. When those 20 rounds were gone, so was he. Unless he glanced down the knoll. 15 yards below lay the dead American soldier he had crawled past earlier. The man's cartridge belt was still full. The BAR and the M1 Garand used the same ammunition. Different feed systems, yes. But cartridges were cartridges. He just needed to reach them. And reaching them meant leaving the knoll, leaving cover, and crawling directly into the arcs of 2 MG42 teams that desperately wanted him dead. It was suicide. It was madness. It was also the only way 30 Americans behind him would live another minute. Alton slung the BAR against his chest, dug his elbows back into the frozen dirt, and began the crawl into fire. For a moment, Alton lay flat on the crest of the knoll, listening. Not with his ears, those were already ringing from 2 hours of gunfire, but with the raw animal instinct that had kept him alive since childhood. The battlefield had a rhythm. You learned it the way a hunter learned wind. You felt when predators paused, when prey shifted, when silence thickened before a kill. Right now, the rhythm said one thing: move, right now. 40 later, Nest #3 opened fire again, the MG42's ripping snarl shredding the air inches above him. Tracers zipped over his skull like red lightning. The Germans weren't firing blind anymore, they were firing angry. 2 nests lost to 1 American? They weren't going to let a third fall. Alton pressed himself flat against the slope, slung the empty BAR tight to his chest, and began crawling downward. The knoll had been protection on the way up. Now it was a funnel guiding German fire straight onto him. At 5 yards, dirt exploded beside his face. At 8 yards, a burst cracked so close he could feel the heat of the friction-burned air. At 10 yards, a grenade detonated behind him, blasting soil into the sky, showering him in grit. But he kept going, not fast, not recklessly, just steady, controlled, calculated, exactly the way he stalked deer through the woods of Spring Mount. 15 yards. He reached the dead American. The soldier lay twisted, helmet cracked, uniform soaked with dark, frozen blood. His cartridge belt was intact. Alton rolled the body gently, almost respectfully, because even under fire, there were things you didn't do with roughness. 6 clips, 8 rounds per clip, 48 rounds. Same, 30-06, Springfield ammunition the BAR used. Different feeding system, yes, but the BAR didn't care where the rounds came from as long as they were the right caliber. The problem was time. It took 10 minutes to load a BAR magazine by hand in training conditions. He didn't have 10 minutes. He had seconds. He scooped the first clip, popped the 8 cartridges into his palm, and grabbed an empty BAR mag. His hands shook not from fear, but from adrenaline, and the cold, the tremor of muscles pushed beyond human limits. He jammed the rounds in, one by one. A burst of MG-42 fire ripped through the air overhead. The dirt around him convulsed. He kept loading. That was all he could manage before his fingers gave out, stiff with cold and dust. "Good enough," he whispered. He shoved the magazine into the BAR, pocketed the remaining Garand clips, and started crawling backward uphill into the German guns, into the open. The only place in the entire field more suicidal than the base of the knoll was the top of it. But that was where he was needed. Back to the summit. Crawling uphill under machine gun fire broke the rules of physics and common sense. Bullets tended to find high points first. Every inch he climbed pushed him closer to the angles German gunners wanted. At 5 yards from the crest, a bullet sliced a groove in the soil beside his cheek. At 4 yards, a burst cracked directly over him, splintering the frozen stubble. At 3 yards, another grenade detonated behind him, lifting a wave of heat and pressure that washed over his spine. He didn't stop. He didn't think about stopping. He wasn't crawling to live. He was crawling because 30 men behind him would die if he didn't. Finally, he reached the top. As his helmet cleared the skyline, a burst from Nest #3 shaved a line through the air so close his ears rang as if slapped by a giant hand. He rolled left, slammed the BAR into the dirt, and returned fire. Short bursts. Tight control. 16 precious rounds. The Germans ducked. Alten breathed. The second hour of the battle had begun. Between 1 p.m. and 2 p.m., the fight became something primal. Not tactics, not doctrine, not strategy, just will. The Germans attacked in waves, probing, advancing, testing the limits of one American on a hill who refused to die. At 1:05 p.m., a 3-man fire team attempted to flank the knoll on the right. Alten killed 2. The third retreated. At 1:12 p.m., Nest #3 intensified fire, trying to blind him with sustained bursts. He suppressed it with 5-round counters, shooting not at the gun but at the slivers of movement around it. At 1:20 p.m., another assault element, possibly the remnants of the earlier platoon, tried to cross 120 yards of open field. Alten shot the lead man, then the second, then the third. They broke again. Every shot he fired was deliberate. Every burst was earned. By 1:30 p.m., he had reloaded his BAR magazines 3 times by hand under fire, using Garand clips that were never meant for the task. By 1:40 p.m., the German infantry finally hesitated. Not because they feared the knoll, not because they feared the BAR, but because they feared the American on it. He wasn't fighting like a soldier responding to orders. He wasn't reacting. He was reading them the way a hunter reads the forest. They moved, he shot. They hesitated, he repositioned. They flanked, he shifted angles. They paused, he breathed. To them, it must have felt like there were 3 or 4 Americans on that hill. There was only one. At approximately 1:20 p.m., Nest #3 had gone strangely quiet for a few seconds. But at 1:45 p.m., it fell silent for good. Maybe Alten hit the gunner during a burst and didn't notice. Maybe the crew withdrew. Maybe they ran out of ammunition. No one knows. What mattered was simple. The last German machine gun that pinned the platoon was finally dead. The battlefield exhaled. For the first time in nearly 2 hours, American soldiers dared to lift their heads. They saw bodies strewn across the field, German bodies lying in arcs around the knoll like spokes radiating from a wheel. They saw the shattered earth where MG-42 rounds had plowed trenches through dirt. They saw the knoll pockmarked with bullet holes, dozens of them, some so close together they formed single, jagged craters. And they saw Alten, still on the crest, still firing, still moving, still alive. A man who statistically, mathematically, tactically, should have been killed in the first 10 seconds. A man who had spent 2 hours in the open under converging machine gun fire and somehow turned it into an advantage. A man who had not allowed the Germans a single clean shot at the men behind him. At 2 p.m., Alton fired the last bullets in his weapon. The BAR clicked open, empty. He exhaled, not in victory, not in relief, but in exhaustion so deep it seemed to hollow him out. The field had gone quiet. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but quiet enough that he could hear the distant groans of the wounded, the crackle of burning grass, the muffled orders of officers trying to reorganize. He slung the empty BAR, slid off the knoll, and began walking back toward American lines. Men stared at him as he approached mud-caked, trembling, uniform torn in 3 places, BAR stock splintered by a bullet, eyes burning with exhaustion and disbelief. Someone whispered, "You held them. You held them for 2 hours. Alone." Alton didn't answer. He didn't need to. The battlefield had already spoken for him. When Alton stepped off the knoll, the battlefield felt unreal, as if someone had muted the world. No machine guns. No mortar blasts. No screams. Just the eerie quiet of a place that had been loud for too long. American soldiers, men who had been pinned flat for nearly 2 hours, lifted themselves out of frozen soil, blinking like survivors crawling from collapse. A medic rushed to Alton, running hands across his arms, his chest, his neck, searching for wounds. Nothing. Not a scratch. Just 3 clean bullet holes in his uniform, a torn sleeve, and a BAR stock split by a round that should have killed him. "How? How are you still alive?" someone said. Alton didn't answer. He didn't have the breath for explanations. He didn't have the words for them either. He simply lowered the BAR, still warm, still smeared with dirt, and let the silence swallow him. The officers arrive. Minutes later, officers from Company C approached. The lieutenant, who had been pinned down 20 meters behind the line, looked at Alton like he was looking at an apparition. He had seen only glimpses of the battle, brief flashes of muzzle bursts from the knoll, bodies falling in German lines, the MG-42 fire shifting away from the platoon to hammer a single, defiant silhouette. But he hadn't seen how it happened. No one had. Only Alton. Only the Germans. "Did you hold that position alone?" the lieutenant asked. Alton nodded once. Why? It wasn't accusation. It wasn't disbelief. It was the kind of question an officer asks when something beyond doctrine just happened, something the manuals don't explain. Alton looked back at the knoll, the field behind it, the men slowly rising to their feet. "They needed someone to shoot at," he said simply. The lieutenant exhaled. A long, slow breath, the kind only a man who understood the full meaning of survival could release. "Get him water," he said quietly. "And someone write this up." The next day, when intelligence teams swept the battlefield, the aftermath revealed the true magnitude of what had happened. Bodies lay in a 180-degree arc in front of the knoll, some sprawled in the open, others in the shallow folds where they had tried to advance. Some were from the machine gun nests, others from the assault platoon, others still from the probing teams sent to flank the position. 20 to 25 corpses directly in front. 35 to 40 more scattered across the field. In total is approximately equal to 60 German casualties dead or mortally wounded inflicted by a single BAR gunner. 2 destroyed MG-40 Edois nests. 1 disabled by sheer suppression and attrition. 1 halted platoon-level assault. 1 saved American patrol. And all of it from a knoll barely 3 meters high. Anzio had seen brutality. Anzio had seen heroism, but Anzio had never seen this. Word moved fast. By nightfall, the story of the one-man knoll defense had traveled through the 30th Infantry Regiment, then the 3rd Infantry Division, then to Major General Lucien Truscott himself. Truscott was a man who had seen everything: Sicily, North Africa, the worst the Wehrmacht had to offer. He was not easily impressed, but when the report crossed his desk, he read it twice. A lone private held off 3 MG-42s and a platoon for 2 hours under continuous fire with a BAR? It seemed impossible. It should have been impossible. And yet, over 60 German casualties and dozens of American survivors confirmed that it had simply happened. Truscott issued his statement with the precision of a commander who hated exaggeration. Private First Class Knappenberger fought as a one-man army. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor went forward immediately. On May 26th, 1944. After Anzio was finally broken open and Rome liberated, Alton was ordered back to the United States. He stood in a dress uniform beneath the solemn gaze of military brass as his citation was read aloud, voluntarily exposed himself to direct machine gun fire, held an elevated position under continuous assault, inflicted heavy casualties, maintained fire despite exhaustion, ammunition shortage, and overwhelming odds, saved the lives of his platoon. The words were formal, precise, emotionless, but everyone in the room knew what they really meant. He did what no doctrine would ever ask a soldier to do. He climbed into death's hands and refused to die. The Medal of Honor was placed around his neck. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. Alton was not built for ceremonies, but he saluted sharp, clean, perfect. Because some honors weren't for the man receiving them. They were for the men who survived because of him. When the war ended, Alton didn't chase glory. He didn't write books. He didn't tour as a celebrity. He went home to Pennsylvania, worked as a truck driver, then a supervisor on an asphalt crew, married, raised children, taught his grandchildren how to fish and hunt using the same skills that had saved 30 men at Anzio. Neighbors knew he had a Medal of Honor, but he never mentioned it. If someone asked, he would shrug and say, "I just did my job." But the truth was simpler, deeper, sharper. He did the job only one man in 1,000 could have done, and only one man in 1,000,000 would have dared. Official doctrine never added a chapter titled Human Bait Tactics. How could it? You cannot teach soldiers to risk themselves the way Alton did. But at Fort Benning, infantry instructors retold the story every year not as regulation, but as revelation. Initiative is a weapon. Terrain is a weapon. Instinct can outweigh doctrine. And sometimes, the man who climbs into fire saves more lives than the men who hide from it. Alton's lesson became a quiet, unofficial truth in the U.S. Army. Exposure equals visibility. Visibility equals control. Control decides the battle. Generals didn't phrase it that way, but hunters understood. And so did every soldier who heard the story of the Knoll. Alton Warren Knappenberger died on June 9, 2008, at the age of 84. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery among heroes, though no headstone around him carried a story quite like his. His marker is simple. Alton W. Knappenberger, PFC, U.S. Army. Medal of Honor? No mention of the 60 Germans. No mention of the 2 hours under fire. No mention of the knoll that became a fortress under his hands. But somewhere near Cisterna di Latina, the knoll still exists. A rise in the earth barely tall enough to cast a shadow. A place where a 20-year-old deer hunter from Pennsylvania rewrote the rules of infantry combat. A place where one man proved that courage, instinct, and impossible determination can turn 3 meters of elevation into the most important ground in a 10-square-kilometer battlefield. A place where 30 Americans lived because one American refused to die. War produces statistics, reports, casualty tables, operations maps filled with arrows and dates. But every once in a while, war produces something the numbers can't explain. A moment so far beyond doctrine, beyond probability, beyond reason, that it lives not in strategy books, but in human memory. February 1st, 1944, was one of those moments. A 20-year-old private, anonymous, unremarkable, unknown even within his own regiment, walked into the most exposed position on the battlefield and held back an entire German assault for nearly 2 hours. He wasn't trained for it. He wasn't ordered to do it. He wasn't supposed to survive it, but he did. And in surviving, he saved over 30 men whose names the world will never hear, but whose lives continued because one man chose to stand in the open when everyone else was forced to lie flat. When historians talk about Anzio, they talk about strategy, supply lines, and missed opportunities. But between those lines, hidden inside the chaos, is a single knoll no higher than a man's shoulders that briefly became the center of the world. A knoll defended not by a squad, not by a platoon, but by one soldier armed with a bar, 16 rounds, and a lifetime of instincts shaped in the quiet woods of Pennsylvania. The Medal of Honor citation captured the facts. But citations don't capture why it mattered. Here is why. Because courage is contagious. Because initiative spreads like fire. Because one man refusing to die forces the enemy to rethink the entire battle. Because when Alton Knappenberger climbed that knoll, he gave every soldier behind him something that had been missing for 15 silent, terrifying minutes. Hope. Every burst he fired said, "Not today." Every reload under fire said, "You are not alone." Every second he stayed alive said, "You still have a chance." And sometimes that is enough to turn paralysis into action, enough to turn fear into survival, enough to turn a battlefield into a story worth remembering. Alton never bragged, never called himself a hero, never claimed he had done anything more than his job. But maybe that's why his story matters. Heroes who chase glory eventually fade. But heroes who serve quietly, who return home, raise families, work everyday jobs, teach their children to fish, and carry their memories alone. Their stories become something else. They become reminders. Reminders that greatness doesn't always wear stripes or stars. Sometimes it wears mud, exhaustion, and a uniform pierced by bullets that somehow missed everything vital. Reminders that courage is often just a moment, a decision no one else saw coming, made by someone no one expected. And reminders that the smallest rise in the earth, barely 3 meters tall, can become immortal ground when one ordinary man refuses to surrender it. Today, the knoll still sits near Cisterna di Latina. Most who pass it will never know what happened there. The soil doesn't speak, the wind doesn't remember, but history does. And so do the men whose lives continued because Alton chose to climb toward danger instead of away from it. A field, a knoll, a bar gunner, a choice. That is all it took to carve a legend into the war that was supposed to swallow him. And in that legend lies the quiet truth of infantry combat. Doctrine guides soldiers. Instinct saves them. And sometimes, one man's instinct is enough to save everyone else. War rarely teaches its lessons gently, and the story of Private First Class Alton Warren Knappenberger reveals that the deepest insights often emerge from moments when normal rules collapse and instinct becomes the final authority. His actions on February 1st, 1944, demonstrate that doctrine, while valuable, is never a substitute for human judgment. Textbooks and tactics can tell soldiers where to stand and how to move, but they cannot account for every terrain feature, every unexpected collapse in leadership, or every moment when survival hinges on a single decision made under fire. The lesson embedded in Knappenberger's ascent onto that exposed knoll is that adaptability is not merely a useful skill. It is the dividing line between life and death in situations where structured guidance fails. Alton teaches that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The battlefield at Cisterna was not a place where bravery was rewarded. It was a place where the first man who lifted his helmet died instantly. Fear was rational. Freezing was rational. Staying low, invisible, and protected by inches of soil was rational. Yet Knappenberger chose something entirely irrational by military standards. He moved toward the gunfire, toward the elevation, and toward visibility. His courage was not theatrical but deeply functional. He understood, even without articulating it, that if everyone waited for a perfect opportunity, the opportunity would never come. His willingness to take the initiative reminds us that decisive action in moments of uncertainty can redirect events for dozens of others who cannot act for themselves. Courage, in this sense, becomes a form of leadership, quiet, instinctive, and often unseen until the aftermath reveals its magnitude. Another lesson arises from his hunting instincts, which he carried from Pennsylvania woodlands into the chaos of Italy. He learned as a boy that elevation creates vision, and that vision creates control. While the army taught him to seek cover, hunting taught him to seek advantage. On that battlefield, The advantage lay not in hiding, but in seeing. His decision to climb the knoll was not madness, but a deliberate application of civilian skills to a military problem. This blending of experiences shows that human adaptability often depends on the willingness to draw from unexpected parts of one's life. Skills developed in peace, patience, observation, restraint, reading of subtle movement can become decisive assets in crisis. The lesson is that expertise is not siloed. A person's entire history becomes their toolkit, and unlikely knowledge can become vital when conventional methods fail. The battle also underscores the importance of initiative when leadership becomes paralyzed. For the first 15 minutes, officers could not move, could not assess the battlefield, and could not issue effective orders. The platoon was frozen by overlapping machine gun fire that created a psychological and physical cage. Knappenberger's instinct to act without instruction reminds us that leadership is not confined to rank. Authority creates structure, but initiative creates momentum. When situations collapse into chaos, the person who chooses to move, even without permission, may be the only one capable of breaking the stalemate. His example teaches that organizations survive crises not because everyone follows rules flawlessly, but because someone recognizes when rules no longer apply. The story also illustrates endurance as a strategic resource. For nearly 2 hours, Alton endured exhaustion, shock, dehydration, and physical strain while maintaining focus under relentless fire. Survival was not determined by strength alone. It was determined by his ability to manage fear, regulate breathing, and ration both ammunition and energy. He demonstrated that endurance is not simply physical stamina but mental discipline, the ability to remain functional while every external factor demands collapse. In life, endurance is often misunderstood as passive persistence, when in fact it is active decision-making under pressure. The decision to stay engaged, to continue solving problems, and to resist the temptation to surrender to chaos. His improvised reloading under fire reveals another lesson. Resourcefulness thrives when perfection is not an option. Manually transferring rounds from Garand clips into BAR magazines while surrounded by MG42 fire was not ideal, but it was possible. The difference between possible and ideal often determines survival. He did what the situation allowed, not what doctrine prescribed. This teaches that problem solving in extreme conditions requires flexibility, creativity, and the willingness to perform tasks imperfectly yet effectively. The world does not pause for ideal circumstances. Progress depends on using whatever tools remain within reach. A further insight emerges from the reactions of the men behind him. After 2 hours, they rose not because the battlefield had become safe, but because he made it survivable. His actions radiated stability in an environment defined by instability. People often need only one example of defiance, one anchor of certainty, to rediscover agency. Knappenberger's presence on the knoll functioned as a psychological strongpoint. He absorbed the fear they could not escape, giving them space to act again. This underscores a profound lesson about leadership. The influence of a single individual can extend far beyond their physical position. One person's determination can change the emotional climate of an entire group. His later modesty provides another dimension to the lesson. Alton returned home quietly, without boastfulness, and lived the rest of his life as an ordinary man despite having performed an extraordinary act. His humility teaches that greatness does not require recognition to be real. Acts of courage do not lose value when they are unspoken. His life invites us to reconsider how we define heroism, not in medals, not in grand speeches, but in the willingness to act at the precise moment when action matters most. Finally, his story teaches that doctrine shapes soldiers, but instinct saves them. Manuals provide frameworks, but real situations demand interpretation. The terrain, the timing, the angle of fire, the morale of comrades, the behavior of the enemy, none of these match the diagrams. Knappenberger understood that doctrine is a guide, not a verdict. The greatest lesson he leaves is that individuals must integrate knowledge with instinct, discipline with creativity, and rules with judgment. Survival, and sometimes victory, depends on knowing when to follow doctrine and when to transcend it. In the end, Alton Knappenberger's stand on that small Italian knoll becomes more than a tale of heroism. It becomes a reflection on human agency in the face of overwhelming threat. It reminds us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary decisions when the moment demands it. And it teaches that courage, adaptability, initiative, and humility are not merely battlefield virtues, they are life virtues, forged in pressure and revealed in action. Life lessons from Knappenberger. Asterisk, asterisk. In the end, Alton Knappenberger didn't leave us a manual. He didn't write a book. He didn't lecture about bravery or instinct or rising to the moment. But his actions on that frozen Italian field became the lesson. He showed that courage isn't noise or fury. It's a quiet decision you make when no one is watching. When every logical choice says, stay down, and something inside you whispers, stand up. He proved that instincts matter. The instincts we build long before a crisis ever arrives. A boy climbing tree stands in Pennsylvania would one day climb a battlefield knoll and save 30 men who could not move. He taught that initiative isn't reckless. It's recognizing the moment when waiting becomes more dangerous than acting. When leaders are pinned, when doctrine fails, when the situation breaks every rule, someone must be the first to move. And most of all, he reminded us that heroism doesn't always look like medals or speeches. Sometimes it looks like a man lying in the dirt, hands shaking, barrel smoking, doing the one thing that still needs to be done, because nobody else can. Alton Knappenberger didn't see himself as a hero, but the men who lived because of him did. And maybe that's the real lesson. Greatness isn't who you say you are. It's what others become because of you.